What is the worst accident that happened at your workplace? When I worked for Walmart supply chain, the receiving crew wouldn't put the pallets all the way in the rack. One had a huge piece of wood sticking out, and our forklift guy swiveled into it. It impaled him in the shoulder and permanently disabled his arm. Then, when I worked at Ecolab, a chemical loader didn't wear his PPE and spilled acid on his pants. The acid ate through his skin and into his muscles, and now he's wheelchair-bound even after the skin grafts. Another incident was when one of the acid delivery guys didn't wear his face shield. He needed facial reconstruction surgery and went blind. Acids are no joke. I work in a manufacturing facility. We have maintenance guys everywhere doing stuff and fixing robots, repairing conveyors, etc. One day, a gentleman from an outside contractor was using a hole saw to cut a hole for wires to run to a new machine. Unfortunately, he hit a live conduit and was immediately struck with enough power to run an assembly line. In that 1 second, when his drill cut that bunch of wires, he got shot back 30 feet. His face shield melted to his face. His gloves fused all of his fingers together. His teeth burned out of his head, and one of his eyes was destroyed. The entire plant lost power for 30 seconds when that happened. It was so gruesome they had to offer counseling for everyone that witnessed it. The man survived somehow and is still being treated for severe nerve damage and third-degree electrical burns. I worked as a cook in an upscale Italian restaurant in my early 20s. One of my co-workers would ask me every night to close for him, and being broke, I often would. The last night we worked together, he asked me to close for him as usual, but I just wasn't feeling it that night, so I said no. He was the type of guy to not wear non-slip shoes in the kitchen. He was up cleaning in the grill hoods when he fell in the deep fryer. His shoe melted to his foot. His foot looked like Freddy Krueger's face. I'm out of the food service industry now, but I think about that often. I used to manage a shredding company, the ones with the mobile shredding trucks. The driver who was operating the shredder decided that the best way to clear a jam would be to jump in the shredder and stomp on the paper. It was very fortunate that the driver's helper was just coming out of the office building bringing more paper, so he heard the scream from inside the truck and managed to hit the emergency stop button. The driver survived thanks to the helper, but his foot did not. It was chewed up to about halfway up his ankle. It did not look pretty. My brother used to manage a restaurant. It was closing time and the kitchen personnel were cleaning everything before they left. Rules are there for a reason, and there was one very specific rule. Do not stand on top of the fryer to clean the extracting chimney. Unfortunately, one of the guys in the kitchen broke that rule, and he fell inside the fryer. His whole legs up to the genitals were instantly fried. His skin fused with his pants and started to fall. The guy recovered, but the therapy was long and ultra-painful, as the doctors basically had to remove all the skin from his legs. My brother said he had never seen something that horrible in his entire life. Years before that, my brother worked at a store, and one of the stock guys was handling hot beer bottles. They usually explode if you don't handle them carefully. One of the bottles exploded, and the lid hit the guy's eye, cutting it. The guy started screaming because he couldn't see. When my brother arrived at the place, the guy looked at him and his eye was deflating, losing the vitreous humor from the wound. Yeah, my brother saw some weird stuff at work. In 1995, I worked at a furniture factory. We bought lumber as logs and cut and machined it to the sizes we needed to make the various pieces of solid wood furniture that we sold. It was a small company and not very well funded. Summer came, and the owner saw a chance for cheap labor, so he hired a bunch of high school kids. Technically, OSHA rules would not allow anyone under 18 to operate equipment. The owner wasn't so big on OSHA or having machinery with the right guards. One of the high school students was the quarterback of the football team. He was heavily recruited, and it was rumored that he was going to sign a letter of intent to play for a Big 12 school. Anyway, that day he was helping one of the old-timers cut parts on a big ripsaw. He goes to grab a piece of wood coming off the blade, and it kicked in a way that he didn't anticipate. He somehow managed to cut off his hand at the wrist. In shock, he tries to grab his hand with his good hand and cuts 3 fingers off his other hand. I remember we were waiting for an ambulance to arrive while the boss had me looking under the saw for the fingers. This happened at the hospital where I worked. An elderly patient was taken for an MRI on a metal table. Of course, when they got close, it stuck to the magnet with the patient caught in between. Several ribs were broken, and they had to reverse the magnet, which cost several $100,000. It took a few hours before someone qualified could come do it. The entire time, the patient was crushed between the metal bed and the MRI magnet. I'm a surgeon, so I was consulted to make sure the patient didn't need a chest tube or operative fixation of her rib fractures. She didn't need either, but she had to stay for several days in the hospital. I was an OSHA investigator, and I had just completed training in a state with a small budget. I was called to a site where a man was crushed to death by a crane jib. Mind you, federal OSHA officers aren't even allowed to do a fatality inspection until they've been with the agency for 2 years or longer. Anyway, I go on site to do the investigation. Apparently the guy was stowing his jib, the portion of a crane that extends the boom length and is usually stowed on the side, when it popped off the side of the crane with him inside the latticework. The jib fell roughly 7 feet and rolled over the guy. The jib weighed around 5,700 pounds. The interview with his oiler/rigger was a little tough because they'd been working together for 15 years and were close. But the thing that really solidified it for me was when I went to the autopsy and saw where the jib had landed. It landed right on the poor man's crotch, and let me tell you, it did not look pretty down there. I was told he had survived for several hours after the incident. I just hope they drugged the hell out of him in his final hours. I used to work for a recycling company and was working on the line. One day, around Halloween, my coworkers took out a corpse. Now, it's not unusual to see fake corpses around this time. Sometimes they are stuffed to make it look very real for Halloween. Anyways, they were kind of moving it around when all hell broke loose. Turns out, it was a real person. He was a homeless guy who slept inside the cardboard recycling bin. He got taken by the truck and was squished to death. I can never forget that scene and the smell. I work in a Randall's Deli. My coworker was taking the rotisserie chickens out of the giant convection oven. He popped the door but didn't move his right arm, and the 400-degree steam immediately broiled it. I'm talking skin instantly bubbling, then starting to peel off his forearm. Another time I saw a guy who was cleaning a hot fryer fill the heat glove that went to his elbow up with hot oil. It instantly degloved his arm. Working in kitchens is wild. This is not as gruesome as some of the stories here, but still quite sad. I was a dairy farmer in my former life, and we got this new apprentice, a relative of the boss or something. Kid had zero farming experience whatsoever. I kept warning him not to duck down when putting the cups on the cows as they could get feisty. The bar is there for a reason. Young fella thought he was special, and I was just an old crank. Well, the spring heifers come in and they've never been milked before. I'm starting because I'm seasoned and I know what I'm doing. Young fella, of course, thinks he is it and goes in for a go. He ducks his head down as he's been warned not to do time and time again. A heifer kicks out and the kid goes flying. He lost half the skin around his eye and is lying there, incoherent. It took an hour for the ambulance to arrive. By then he was having seizures and unresponsive. He was placed in a medical coma and is now in a wheelchair in a vegetative state. He was just 19 at the time. This accident haunted my dad for his entire life. In the 1960s, he worked in a factory that used mercury for some processes. At some point during the night shift, mercury dripped onto an air system and released mercury vapor throughout the factory. He came in for the morning shift and found 11 dead bodies on the shop floor. About 5 years ago, I was working at a small cafe as a cook. One day, we were super busy. During the chaos, the kitchen manager knocked an aerosol can of this non-stick spray called Vaseline into the deep fryer and didn't notice. The time bomb was started. A few minutes go by and then it exploded, sending 5 gallons of 350-degree oil into the air and completely splashing me. I'd been standing about a foot away with my back to it. I began to scream and tear off my clothes while the most excruciating pain of my life set in. An ambulance was called, and off I went to the hospital. I just tried to keep breathing and not go into thermal shock. 6 weeks and 2 8-hour skin graft surgeries later, not to mention the horrific treatments involving removing my bandages and cleaning the wounds every single day, I staggered myself out of the hospital and went home. But it wasn't over there. Phase 2 of hell was another 6 weeks of withdrawal from every single painkiller you can imagine. Did you know fentanyl lollipops are a thing? Sometimes I think those withdrawals were even worse than the burn. I'm okay now and completely recovered, other than the fact that my entire back looks like Freddy Krueger's face. Speaking of faces, I'm just glad I had my back to the fryer when it happened. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. I work in urgent care that also sees occupational injuries. I once saw this young guy for a work comp injury. This dum-dum was horsing around at work, sitting and riding on a conveyor belt. He rode it to the end but failed to get off before the belt system recirculated, and his scrotum and perineum were ripped open. We shipped him to a trauma center. I'm not sure what happened to him. This happened at a power plant where we were carrying out some maintenance work. We had 2 people up on a cooling tower with a suspended cart, much like those used by window cleaners. They were painting the inside of the tower, and the overspray got onto the cables and jammed them in the pulleys. The 2 people on the cart and their supervisor made several errors in judgment. They tried to manually disengage the brakes to lower the cart. However, they didn't synchronize with each other properly, and the cart banked heavily to one side. Then one of the cable mounts snapped, and the entire thing came crashing down. It was a 200 feet drop. One was not wearing a safety belt and just slammed into the concrete. The other was wearing a safety belt. The cart was still attached from one side and somehow stopped 30 feet short of the floor, but very violently. He was thrown out and died from whiplash. He was found hanging just a few feet from the floor by his belt, shock absorber fully extended, but it wasn't enough to save him from the extreme forces. Unfortunately, I saw the scene right after as we gathered to see what the crashing noise was. That image will be etched into my memory forever. I'm from a small town in Kentucky. There are no jobs outside of the lumber mills. My father was a repairman at the mill. I was in high school and my mom calls and says my dad was hurt. He's alive, but 2 of his fingers got pulled off, not cut, by a chain. Approximately 50% of each finger was pulled off. That was the day I knew I had to get my degree and leave that town to avoid working in the mills. This is not as bad as some people's stories here, but I worked at Amazon. When I started the job, a manager laughingly told me that during the summer, they have ambulances parked in the parking lot just in case. I thought he was joking. I was there for around 9 months and it started getting hotter. The warehouse didn't have AC, just giant exhaust fans blowing hot air around. A girl in pre-sort directing traffic, basically sending boxes down the appropriate line, just suddenly collapsed, as in full-on passed out on the line. The line stopped and the girl was taken to the nurse. She was back on the line an hour later. The reason it disturbed me was the fact that she came back. She passed out and still had to finish her shift. I worked at a retail clothing store. A coworker was hanging a shirt on a hanger on one of those metal hooks that comes out so that the shirt was front-facing. She couldn't quite reach, so she jumped up and her ring got caught on the metal hook and it ripped her finger off. I had never seen so much blood. The ambulance took her to the hospital, but they weren't able to reattach the finger. I was coming in for work when I noticed a couple of paramedics coming out of the cold kitchen. I went in to find out what was going on and saw a girl sitting down in the corner with her hand in a bowl of ice water. She had been working with isomalt, a type of sugar alcohol used to make 3D sugar sculptures and candies, when she got sidetracked talking to someone. Her hand was in the pot stirring it, and the isomalt bubbled up over her hand. It gave her 3rd-degree burns. They pulled some of the hardened sugar off to get to the damaged areas, and some of her skin came off with it like a glove. Horrific indeed. I worked loading trucks at UPS for about 8 months in 2007. I saw a guy's bicep snap off of his elbow. We got him to the hospital, but I threw up a bit. The whole muscle was bunched up under his skin. It was messed up, to say the least. Before that, I worked at an iron foundry where right before I was hired, a guy had worn jeans tucked into cowboy boots one day. Due to a mishap with the ladle, his boot was filled with molten iron. They tried to take the boot off, but the foot went with it. The guys I worked with were still traumatized by it. I've seen this twice when working at a McDonald's over 3 years in a small town, so I can't imagine how common it must be. A mom went to the bathroom with her small kid in tow because she was by herself. 3 minutes later, I heard blood-curdling screams. Turns out, the kid had their fingers in the door jamb when the mom opened it up, which completely severed the tip of their middle finger. There was blood everywhere. Both times, I was the one that had to grab a small bag of ice to keep the fingertip cold so they could reattach it at the hospital. I also had to clean up all of the blood. I still shiver whenever I think about it. I worked at a large manufacturing company that produced excavators. I was hired at the same time as another guy my age. We hit it off and became good friends. We both worked the second shift as material handlers and equipment operators. Another guy on our team was a cranky old man who would always make mistakes and violate safety policies. One day in the middle of our shift, my buddy was helping the old grump use an industrial crane to move a part that weighed 800 pounds. Somehow, the bastard messed up the controls and sent this 800-pound chunk of cast steel right into my buddy. It completely crushed his femur and fractured his tibia and fibula. The sound of his bones breaking was loud enough to be heard across the entire manufacturing plant. His screams were horrific. Everyone ran to help get the part off of him and call EMS. Everyone, except the old f***. He just got into his forklift and casually drove outside of the facility looking for the next post on his list. My buddy was in the hospital for months and was in physical therapy for over a year. Since we were contractors, the only thing he was given was a half-paid medical bill and a "sorry that sucks, but we no longer require your services." He took his life and left behind his 3-year-old daughter. I have since shifted my career toward workplace safety, and I try my best to use foresight and intuition to prevent accidents like this from ever occurring. A man operating a forklift on a ramp somehow tipped the lift forward and was ejected out the front of the lift and run over, killing him. A few months later, during the investigation of the accident, an investigator was trying to recreate the conditions of the accident. Well, he succeeded and was killed in the same manner. I work at a zip line at a day camp. A few years ago, one of my coworkers was finishing up at her station where she was sending kids on the zip line, and she was about to use the zip line herself. However, she forgot to make sure that her zip line tether was connected to her harness and jumped off the platform. She fell 30 feet to the ground. I heard her body hit the ground. I saw the broken bones sticking out of her leg. I heard her screams of agony as I ran halfway across the 50-acre camp to notify the main office. Thankfully, she survived. She managed to land in the exact perfect way to minimize her injuries, on her feet, so her legs were able to somewhat cushion her fall. If she had hit the ground in any other way, she would have been paralyzed or killed. She's extremely lucky to be alive and walking today, but it's still so haunting to know what could have happened. Now I'm the one who works at that station where she worked. I still feel a twinge of panic whenever someone jumps off that platform, even after I've double and triple checked everything. I do my best to make sure an incident like that never happens again. Mortician here. An embalmer I worked with poked her finger with a 3-inch needle she was suturing an autopsy up with. She didn't go to the doctor, and the next day it was red and sore. 2 days after that, it swelled up twice its size with a black hole where the needle went in. Turns out she had MRSA. Luckily, that was the only thing she had. She recovered but has a gnarly scar on her finger to this day. This is not my story, but from a former co-worker. He worked for Sara Lee Bread. At this job, they had forklift drivers, just like any other factory job. One day, one of the drivers took a corner too fast and flipped his forklift. Instead of staying inside, he tried to jump out, but he jumped the way the lift was falling, so he went under it and got caught at the waist by the roof cage. Don't worry, it gets worse. Help arrives and the guy is completely coherent because, fun fact, you don't really need your legs to survive. The downside is that everything liquid in him was being held in like a rolled-up tube of toothpaste. Once they remove the forklift off him, he's going to die immediately. There's no way to contain that amount of blood in a way that could save him. So they call his wife, and she's only a few minutes away with the kids. I believe they had 3. They put a welding sheet around the lift and let them all come in and talk to him and give him hugs and kisses. After a few minutes, they lifted it up, and the inevitable happened. That story screwed me up. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to my channel for more Reddit stories. This is Reddit Story Hour. See you in the next video.